Ladies and gentlemen, I have found my new hat. So today we're going to be looking at how to buy that hat. We're going to be talking about pre-Columbian American history. So just a little note. Basically, we divide American history into two sort of chunks. We divide it into the pre-Columbian era, which goes from 600 to 1450 CE. We further subdivide it into two further eras. We have basically the 600 to 900 classical era, which, note, is a different classical era than, for example, the Roman, the Gupta classical era, the classical eras that we've already talked about that roughly coincided around the same time. That's not confusing whatsoever. Then we have the 900 to 1450 CE post-classical period. Then we divide it into a further chunk when the world's worst navigator, Christopher Columbus, rediscovers the New World for the Europeans. So, a little note about the New World. You're probably used to seeing things like dynasties and empires and big nation states, because that's more or less what we've been talking about. You're not really going to see as much of that in the New World. Realistically, there are only two large empires that are sort of equivalent to empires like Rome or the Persians or the Gupta Empire and so on. This would be the Aztec Empire that really only comes at the very end of this period. And finally, the Incan Empire. You have a lot of cultural diffusion, you have lots of trade, but you don't really have the emergence of nation states like we're seeing in Europe and throughout much of the rest of the world around this time period. Really, when you're looking at the Native Americans that inhabit North and South America, you're looking at sort of these a society divided by linguistic groups. Sort of how we talked about how Indo-Europeans share certain things in common. They might not share the exact same language, but their language is similar to other Indo-European speakers, and they might have some of the same ideas about the gods, their mythologies, that sort of thing. Native Americans are very similar in that respect, because outside of the Incans and Aztecs, you basically have city-states, and then you have very localized tribes. Eventually, even into the post-Columbian era, you might see linguistic groups like the Iroquois create tribal confederations, but that's about the extent of it. So by about 1500, there are roughly 200 unique language groups. They are predominantly either nomadic, or they're agriculturalist. Typically, the way it works is that the closer you get to, let's say, central Mexico, the more likely they are to practice an agricultural lifestyle. We do have to say that North and South America, and compared to, let's say, Europe and Asia, is a little behind technologically. It sort of makes sense that they would be, because if you look at let's say, the establishment of agriculture, we talked about the establishment of farming communities as early as 10,000 BCE. We also looked at the emergence of agriculture in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, etc. In this case, like, probably the most important single fact of life in North and South America is that the inhabitants migrated there much later on than, let's say, humans migrated into the Middle East or Europe, etc. As far as we know, nomads crossed over the Bering Land Bridge roughly 20 to 30,000 years ago, BCE, and it takes them a while to move down south and to find a climate that's suitable for agriculture. So, just for some contrast, the Sumerians, the OG agrarian civilization, have roughly a 2,000-year head start over most of their neighbors. And if you think about it, during this time period, they developed things like the city or the large city. Looking at you, Uruk. they develop a calendar, they develop a writing system, they develop irrigation, they develop all of these things that we sort of associate as being essential for agrarian civilizations. If you look at North and South America, agriculture really first starts developing in central Mexico in about 900 BCE. And if you think about it, that means that agriculture, that complex civilization, has only been around in the New World about, 2,000 years by the time Columbus arrives. So the first of these large, complex civilizations in the Americas are the Maya. So the Maya sort of predate almost all the other civilizations by a pretty large margin, about 2000 BCE to 900 CE. So unlike a lot of the other groups that we're going to talk about, the Maya are clustered basically all inside one geographic area, basically the Yucatan Peninsula. Most of the other tribal groups at this time are focused on sort of a nomadic lifestyle. But the Maya definitely settle down and create city-state type organizations. And there are a variety of theories as to why that might be the case. They live essentially in the jungle. And so life in the jungle is complicated. It requires a lot of organization to survive. Obviously, there's plenty of food, but the soil is very, very thin. And yeah, it's just a very complicated region to sort of have a civilization in. So they're not centralized. There's not like a large Mayan empire. Again, they're mostly city-states. But if you add up all the cities sort of at their peak, which would roughly be about 600 to 700 CE, you have about 2 million people, which is a huge chunk of the overall population of North and South America. But sort of like the ancient Greek city-states, they did war against each other pretty frequently. So the rulership of these Mayan city-states was under the authority of usually a monarch. Sometimes they were seen as being divine. Other times they were seen as being, not particularly divine, sort of like a bureaucrat or a magistrate. But most of the time, these rulers had authority that was ritual. So these are not individuals that are necessarily trained in administration. They might struggle to deal with questions of like food distribution, trade, and that kind of thing. In general, the Mayans cultivated cotton, maize, and cocoa, and they had to be pretty innovative in order to farm in the jungle. Just like we talked about with the Chinese probably developed a centralized civilization because of the need to control the flow of rivers like the Yangtze. With the Mayans, you also have sort of complicated agrarian projects, like, for example, draining swamps and marshlands in order to basically create farmland. Or they got together and practiced an early form of slash and burn agriculture, where they would burn large tracts of the jungle in order to make way for agricultural production. So you have this large civilization of about 2 million people, and then starting around 900 CE, they just vanish. And we're not really sure exactly why they do. There's theories related to war, disease, overpopulation. If we look at other periods in history where people just sort of abandon cities, it's probably a combination of these things. Most of the time, cities get abandoned because the climate or the soil or the geography no longer supports the sustainment of agriculture. So does that happen with the Mayans? That's probably fairly likely, but we don't know for sure. All that we know is that these massive cities in the middle of the Yucatan Peninsula gradually get abandoned over time. Okay, let's talk about what we know about Mayan society and culture. And some of these things are going to sort of carry on even after they sort of disappear. So Maya society was heavily stratified. If you remember, that means that there's a pretty stark class division. So at the top, you have the king, who was not necessarily considered divine, like, for example, the pharaohs of Egypt were, but it was seen that they had the blessing of the gods to rule, sort of like an early example of the divine right of kings. So you had a large priestly class that helped facilitate communication with the gods. Now, you had about 80 total ceremonial or religious centers. This includes pyramids, palaces, temples, and these could sometimes accommodate thousands of people. So religion was very central to Mayan life. They had a pantheon of gods, not unlike you see like the Greco-Roman pantheon, or most agrarian societies will have some form of polytheistic sort of pantheon of gods. The construction of these temples was facilitated by the use of large quantities of peasant labor, especially since the Mayans did not invent the wheel, nor did they ever invent metal tools. So they had to compensate with sheer brute force labor. And a lot of these Mayan buildings were incredibly large and sophisticated. If you look at the buildings, for example, at Chichen Itza, not chicken pizza, as some people have suggested, or Tikal. These are very large pyramids, not as large as the Egyptian pyramids, but still extremely impressive, especially considering they were constructed without the use of the wheel or tools. The Mayan people believed in gods that would intervene in human affairs. Like the polytheistic gods of Greece or Rome, the gods could be venal and petty, and if you didn't pay them the appropriate respect, they could basically make you get hit by a bus. So what the Mayans would do often to assuage them would be to offer them sacrifices. These would oftentimes be people captured in war, especially people who were captured royals, people like that. And essentially what they would do is they would beat them, whip them, etc. And the idea was to have as much blood pour out before the victims were ultimately beheaded. And if you think that sounds pretty bad, wait till we get to the Aztecs. It makes the Mayans seem positively cuddly by comparison. The Mayans were incredibly sophisticated mathematically in terms of their architecture, and of course they had not just one, but two calendars. They had a solar calendar, which was, of course, 365 days, but then they had a ritual calendar, which was 260 days. And when those two were combined together, that basically told them when the gods should be appeased, when festivals and rituals needed to be conducted, that kind of thing. If you're looking at relations between the sexes in the Mayan civilization, there was some level of equality. Mayan women got to also participate in these bloodletting ceremonies. Yay! Unfortunately, though, Mayan women weren't given really any political power beyond that. The only real political power influence held by Mayan women was held by the queen, who it was thought would receive religious visions that would sort of buttress her husband, the king's political legitimacy. Finally, the Mayans developed the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian world. And the reason it was so darn difficult to translate and wasn't really successfully translated until the 1980s is because there were multiple ways to write a single word. So extremely advanced mathematically in terms of writing, in terms of the calendar, but don't let that fool you. They will still literally cut your head off. Finally, we move to the second classical civilization in Mesoamerica, and this is Teotihuacan. Say that 5 times fast. I'm not going to. So Teotihuacan is a settlement not in the Yucatan like the Mayans, but in basically the highlands of central Mexico. So they're sort of mysterious. The major sort of linguistic groups that we associate with central Mexico, the Nahua, the Otomi, the Totonac, they're not really associated with any of them. So we still don't really know their name. We just know sort of the name of their city. But even the name of their city is given to us by the Aztecs. We don't even know what they called themselves, which is, kind of sad. Here's what we do know about them. There are cities, and then there are cities. Teotihuacan is a city. It was, this population ranged between 25,000 at the low end. High-end estimates state that it probably had up to 200,000 people. And it had to have been pretty big, because if you look at some of the buildings that remain, this is, by the way, the Pyramid of the Sun. The Pyramid of the Sun has basically just as much volume as the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's not as tall as the Great Pyramid of Giza. You see it as much more sloped. But this is one of the largest buildings, not just in Mesoamerica, but in the entire world. So based upon this setup, you can see that there's probably a lot of city planning that's happened. You can also see that this wasn't a city that was just, let's say, improvised. But beyond that, we don't really know who the people of Teotihuacan are. We also know that, similar to the Maya, they disappeared around 750 CE. Happy Halloween. So, on that note, take a look at these quick review questions, and I will see you next time.